Thanks very much. Very much. Is it 6:30 yet? And it's exactly 6:30. Okay. Everybody knows that I start on the minute. Okay, so my name is Suzanne Wasserman, and I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'd like to first have you join us for our next forum, which is October 7th in Siegel, which is around the corner. William Sorrell is going to talk about the Colored Orphans Asylum, which ran from 1836 to 1946 and was founded by Quaker women and supported by some of Manhattan's first finest families. This talk examines not only the first organization to aid Black orphans, it is additionally an examination of race relations, philanthropy, child labor, and social policy in New York City. Most of the children were indentured from ages 12 to 18 and were assigned to farms in upstate New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and in several cases, Iowa and Kansas. The Colored Orphans Asylum survived despite several financial panics, the destruction of its building in the 1863 draft riots in the Great Depression, 3 wars, several epidemics, racial hostilities, and several economic deprivations to care for orphans, delinquents, and neglected children. The author painstakingly examined the archival records of admissions, indenturing, educational and religious instruction, as well as annual reports, minutes to show how many of the city's elite families, the daughters of Chief Justice John Jay, the grandparents of and father of President Theodore Roosevelt, philanthropists James Lennox and Caroline Stokes, the entrepreneurs John Jacob Astor and R.H. Macy and others banded together to support the home for the city's youth of color at a time when the only other option was the House of Refuge, a place of destitution and depravity. Among the 15,000 children served by the orphanage were John Henry Gooding, a Civil War hero, and some members of the famed World War II unit, the 369th Regiment of the Harlem Hellfighters. Today, after several mergers, it is known as Harlem Dowling West Side Center for Children and Family Services. So today, without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. Cindy R. Lobel is an assistant professor of history at Lehman College at the City University of New York. She is also on the faculty of the Macaulay Honors College and the MALS program at the Graduate Center. Okay. Thanks. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. Lobel earned a BA from Tufts University and a PhD in U.S. history from the Graduate Center here at CUNY. She has taught at Lehman since 2006, offering courses in U.S. history, urban history, and the history of New York City and state. Since 2013, Lobel has served as co-coordinator of Lehman's Writing Across the Curriculum program. Before joining the faculty at Lehman, Lobel was on the visiting faculties of Barnard College, Connecticut College, and Columbia University. Professor Lobel's first book, Urban Appetites, Food and Culture in 19th-Century New York, was released in April 2014 by the University of Chicago Press. Historical Studies in Urban America series. The manuscript of Urban Appetites won the Dixon Ryan Fox Prize awarded by the New York State History Association for the best manuscript on New York history. Lobel is also published in the Winterthur portfolio, Commonplace and History Now. She has spoken at various museums and forums, including the Museum of the City of New York, the Lower Eastside Tenement Museum, and the National Arts Club. Her current research includes a biography of Catherine Beecher to be published by Westview Press in 2015 in their American Women's Biography series, edited by Carol Birkin, and a biography of the 19th century New York African-American oysterman, Thomas Downing. Without further ado, Cindy.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? No one ever has trouble hearing me. Thank you, Suzanne, for that nice introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming. My students are here, so thank you. They had to come. Thank you for those of you who are here who didn't have to come. I'm very excited to be speaking at a Gotham Center forum. As Suzanne mentioned, I did my doctorate at the Graduate Center. This book was really germinated here well, not here, but here in this building. And so it feels like a little bit of a homecoming to be here presenting and talking about it. So what I'm going to do today is a bit of an overview of the book. It's so funny, it takes a long time to write it, and then you have 10 minutes to talk about it. So I'll let you all read it, but in the meantime, I'll give you a bit of a preview about what is in there. But first, I want to ask you a question before I dim the lights. So how many of you, we're getting into fall now, right? So things are changing a little bit, but how many of you shop at a farmer's market? Wow, this is the Manhattan audience. How many of you are members of a CSA? It's community-sponsored agriculture, for those of you who said, what's a CSA? I'm a member of 2 CSAs. I can't really actually even keep up with the work requirement. How about, how many of you, oh, this is a good one. How many of you have eaten in a restaurant this week? How many of you eat every meal in a restaurant? I didn't mention my father is also here. My father eats every meal in a restaurant. He will be taking us all out afterwards. See, that's good for a free forum, right? So these are questions that feel very current. The question about eating in restaurants, about organic food, which actually I didn't ask, but I should have, about farmers markets, about even community-sponsored agriculture, which is really about localism, right? Being concerned about where your food is coming from and having a closer relationship between the producers of the food and the consumers of the food. And these feel like very contemporary issues. But in fact, the roots of these issues and these kinds of concerns about food and the sources of our food, or the connections between how we eat and the settings in which we eat and our identity, these concerns and these issues go well back. They have a very significant history, internationally, globally, as well as locally. So in many ways, everything that seems new is actually somewhat old. And that's a very typical thing for a historian to say, of course, but it also happens to be true in this case. In many ways, this book is about the development of the food landscape that today's food reformers are working very hard to undo. Connecting the producer and the consumer more closely, that process of separation between producer and consumer really is addressed, the beginnings of that process addressed in Urban Appetites. At the beginning of the 19th century in New York City, which is of course what this book focuses on, all food in New York was local, right? Everything came from a relatively local catchment area. New Yorkers did not eat in restaurants because freestanding restaurants barely existed in the first part of the 19th century. New Yorkers ate at home, as most people did. And in most cases actually, those homes were located either in the same structure or very close to where they worked. By the end of the 19th century, the landscape is very, very different. By the end of the 19th century, there are thousands of restaurants in New York City. The producer and consumer are far separated in many cases. Of the producer and consumer of food. There are middlemen, there are private food shops, there is a tremendous range and diversity of food options in the city. So how did this happen? How do we get from point A to point B? Well, there's really a constellation of factors, of changes, technological, political, social, and cultural changes that occurred simultaneous to and in concert with New York City becoming a metropolis. So the growth of the city into a metropolis and the food capital of the world in the 19th century, there is an inextricable connection between these two developments, and that is what Urban Appetites focuses on. So first we'll talk a little bit about the growth of New York City. These are maps. See how much you learned already? The map on the left is New York City in 1789. Oh, do I have a, yeah. Do I have a laser? Yeah. Yeah, a little pointer. Oh, dim the lights. Is that what you were telling me? I thought you were telling me to quiet it down.
No. Here. This number, yeah.
Thank you. Is that better? Yes. He was like, and I thought he was saying shh. Okay. The map on the left is New York City in 1789. How many of you came uptown to get here? How many of you came from downtown? Oh, that's a pretty good, or Brooklyn. Yeah. Queens. All right. How many of you came from uptown? Okay, so okay, good, we're in the middle. So the map on the left, in case you don't recognize it, this is the extent of New York City after the American Revolution. It is really clustered within about a mile of the southern tip of Manhattan. This triangle here, is this happening? I press this middle button? Is it not on? Oh. No, I was pressing the wrong one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. This triangle here is City Hall Park, right there. So really, it's a very small city, and it's not that much bigger than the city was in the 17th century, when it was Dutch New York, or when it was taken over by the British, Dutch New Amsterdam. The city, at this point, the population is about 25,000 people at the end of the American Revolution. Even if it had been 100,000 people, 200,000 people, it still, in 1789, would have been clustered within about a mile of the southern tip of Manhattan. Because until you have reliable ways of before you can live in one place and work in another and be able to get there reliably via transportation, the city can't actually spread geographically. So it's not until the 19th century, with the technological developments like street railroads, first omnibuses, which are horse-drawn buses, eventually the elevated train in the 1870s, that you actually can have the geographic spread of the city. And that's what we're seeing the start of on the right side. So the map on the right is New York in the early 1860s, stretches up to where Central Park is. Central Park opens in the 1850s. The population of the city, okay, remember what I said, 25,000 on the left? By 1860, 800,000. Okay, yeah, that's amazing, right? I mean, I've said that about a million times, and every time I say it, I find it amazing. This is a tremendous period of growth for New York. And you can just imagine what it would be like to be born into that city of 25,000. Every decade in the 19th century, the population of the city doubles. So this gives us a sense of the geographic growth of the city. This is due, as I mentioned, or owing, the population growth, of course, is owing largely to migration and immigration, people coming into the city. The geographic growth of the city is related to technological developments, including transportation developments. Not only the railroads, the street railroads that allow people to live in one place and work in another, but also other forms of transportation outside of the city that we don't always think about, like the Erie Canal. Right, the Erie Canal opens in the 1820s, and it really solidifies New York City's position as the empire of trade, as the center of trade, because it spreads New York City's hinterlands all the way to the Midwest. So all these farm goods from the Midwest now can get via the Erie Canal to Albany and down the Hudson to New York City, and then get packed up with manufactured goods and sent back out there. And so it really solidifies New York City's position in that way. It also really solidifies the west side of Manhattan as a central kind of trading area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So you have the Erie Canal, you have the railroad, both in the city and outside of the city, and you also have steam transportation, steamboats, in the first half of the 19th century that allow for the very significant cheapening carriage of goods and also the speedier carriage of goods. And for food, that really matters, right? Because when we're talking about being able to get to the market without spoiling, right? Prior to this point, things cannot get to the market without spoiling, and so you have this very local catchment area. So in terms of the before picture, what does it look like in New York? How are we getting our food, right? We're talking about before these kinds of developments. So this image is an image of Fly Market. Fly Market in 1826. Fly Market was one of the 6 public markets established in the colonial period that made it into the 19th century. So the public market system goes back in New York City all the way to the colonial era, all the way to the Dutch. This is an early regulated market system established in colonial New York and other cities as well. The public markets were highly regulated. Not all that much was highly regulated in the colonial period, but the public markets were highly regulated because they were considered a public good. This was where fresh food had to be sold, especially fresh meats, butcher's meats, and also produce from the hinterland. So country people, as they were called, would come usually by boat from Long Island, which was Brooklyn and Queens, and also a little bit farther out into Long Island, from New Jersey, from Staten Island, and also from the mainland, so from Manhattan and from the Bronx, which was called Westchester in the 18th century and the early 19th century. So they would bring their goods in to market, and they would sell them in one of the 6 public markets. Fly Market was on the east side, and it became the major public market to service the east side. So Fly Market drew a lot of those country people from Long Island, whereas, say, Washington Market, which was on the west side, drew more people from Manhattan, Westchester, and New Jersey. So what you see in this picture here is the market structure here, which was an open structure, and then down the center of the structure is where the butchers, I thought that went out, where the butcher stands were. So you can, if you can see, can you see it very closely? The meats are hanging in the butcher stands, lining the center of the market, and then around those stands, which is where the country produce would have been sold. In the front of the market, those are the extra market vendors. So these women, and they're pretty much all women, who are selling fruit and vegetables from the baskets at the tables, those are the hucksters. And the hucksters had permission, actually, to sell market goods outside of the market structure, but they tended to sell them very close to the market structure. Hucksters in the colonial period in the early 19th century, these women were some of the most desperate, poorest people in New York City. They were often widowed. They were supporting families on this work. They would scavenge in many cases for whatever it was that they were selling. And as part of this, as an example of this, of what I was saying earlier about the markets being considered a public good, this was almost seen as a form of welfare work on the part of the city, that they allowed these women to do this because they recognized that otherwise they would become essentially wards of the city, that this was their means of employment. That didn't mean that they didn't get in fights with the country people sometimes, right? Because they're selling some of the same stuff that they're selling inside. Although there were rules about hours, so the hucksters could only sell market goods after the main marketing hours were done, so after noon or after 2. So this, as I mentioned, is one of the 6 public markets. All food in New York, all fresh food, was sold in these markets. There were also groceries in colonial New York, but groceries were parallel to the markets, not duplicative of their functions. In other words, the groceries sold dry goods, they sold preserved foods. They did not sell fresh foods very much. I mean, there was some green grocering, but not very much. And they definitely didn't sell meats, or at least not legally, because up until 1843, it was illegal to sell meats in New York City outside of the public markets. More on that later. after all this transportation and technological changes that I mentioned the transportation changes. One thing I didn't mention, which is also very important to expanding the food supply that's coming into New York, is ice. So they actually figure out ways to harvest ice. They cut it large blocks on lakes upstate. They get it into ice houses that are also perfected, and then they can actually refrigerate, or at least cool, the goods that are on these boats. And so it actually extends the amount of time that they can take to get it to market. And actually in New York City, the first group of people to use ice commercially is the butchers in the markets. They actually use them in their stalls to keep their meat fresh for longer. So all these technological changes have a very significant impact on how much food is coming into the city and where it is coming from. And so we go from this kind of country scene, almost very calm view of the markets, and also a market system that really did cater to all New Yorkers. Right. That's not to say that there was equality in terms of the food supply in colonial New York. For one thing, the earlier you could go to the market, the more expensive the food was and the better it was. As the day progressed, the quality of the food declined, and so did the prices. But the markets were the only show in town, and so all New Yorkers got their food from the same place, essentially, from the markets. Okay. This is an image of Washington Market in 1866. So this is the after picture for the public markets. Now, Washington Market, as I mentioned, is on the west side. Washington Market started out as a local market, right? The market where people who lived in the local neighborhood would go and buy their food. But as the 19th century progresses, Washington Market shifts to a more wholesale function, and Washington Market really becomes the major kind of wholesale emporium for food, not only to service the needs of New Yorkers, but that gets shipped out of New York as well to other places. Washington Market basically took over the whole Lower West Side of Manhattan. And the whole area now where Washington Market was is Tribeca. So if you walk around Tribeca, you'll see vestiges of Washington Market. One of those vestiges is there's a park in Tribeca that's called Washington Market Park. There also are, there is a produce exchange there, a produce exchange building there. There are some of those old loft buildings that now house very expensive apartments were actually built for the food production facilities that started to build up around Washington Market. So that, gives you a little bit of a sense of the orientation. So Washington Market goes from a structure kind of like what we saw with the fly market picture very quickly to this. And part of the reason why Washington Market expands so significantly is because, as I mentioned, Washington Market is on the west side, and after the opening of the Erie Canal, all that food is now coming on these boats down the west side and unloaded into Washington Market. So the market activity expands well beyond those few little tables outside of the market and onto all of the streets around the market, and then also all of the kind of auxiliary services that go along with the market. Auxiliary food production starts to move around Washington Market as well. Now, as you can imagine, all of this food coming into New York from all of these places that couldn't get it here before means that there is a tremendous diversity and abundance of food coming into New York. And the commentators were pretty excited by that. So if you look at the press of the 1840s and the 1850s, they talk about all of the tremendous abundance that you will find in these markets. Here is a quote from the New York Mercury, which was a New York City newspaper in 1856. This is about Jefferson Market, which is in the Village. Okay, the quote reads, "On any morning of the 5 days out of the 6 of our weekly calendar, Jefferson Market in this emporium of the New World represents a lap of luxury, the glory of a bountifully supplied and plenteous land. Here are gorgeous avenues of flesh, all garnished with masses and quarters and ribs and loins of the finest beef, in streaks of mellow meat embedded in layers of golden fat. Then they go on about the fat. Interspersed are columns of the whitest marbled fatted mutton. In beautiful relief, milk-white veal and porcine carcasses fill up the intervals with flowers and green of our forest lands. And then they go on to talk about the innocent ducks, the sinless chickens, fowls of every size, form, and hue, with fore and hindquarters of game, with clean bushy tails, all so beautifully and gracefully with succulence interlaced and so temptingly presented. And then they conclude, who could resist such an appeal as here is made upon his senses and gustatory nerves by this cornucopia of the meats, the fruits, and the granaries of this fructiferous land? So, and this is a pretty typical description of the abundance available in the markets. Unfortunately, the market houses themselves are not so reflected of that kind of sensory pleasure, right? The market houses themselves are overcrowded, underserviced. They talk about rats scurrying around in the markets. They talk about food spoiling in the markets. They talk about food spoiling on the boats because there are such bottlenecks, distribution bottlenecks, they can't even get it into the markets without spoiling. And that is partly because of, I mean, in large part, because they cannot deal with the rapid expansion of the amount of food that's coming into New York. But it's also partly because those people who are charged to deal with it, rather than viewing the markets as a public good, increasingly are viewing the markets as a way to line their pockets, right? Because as the 19th century progresses, you also have the rise of at market fees and at market structures as a way to enrich the machine, right? To enrich the corrupt political machine. And so Tammany Hall plays very fast and loose with the markets. They don't actually regulate them in the way that they should. They don't actually make sure that good product is being sold in the market. They don't actually make sure that the vendors in the market are not cheating people at the scales. Instead, they do things like they sell market stalls that are already owned by people, right? They basically sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. Or they shake down the market vendors to pay them more fees. And so there's really very widespread neglect of the public markets. And not only that, the city, which is charged with expanding the public market system, doesn't. So we have that growth that I showed you in the two maps in the beginning of the talk, but there are no new markets built to accommodate those newer neighborhoods that are developing on the edges of the city. So the market system does expand a little bit, but it doesn't go, there are no new markets above 14th Street except for Harlem Market. And so, but increasingly, New Yorkers are living above 14th Street, right? The city is growing, it's becoming spatially stratified, the downtown areas are more commercial, even industrial, the uptown areas are more residential, but those residential areas are not being serviced by the markets. And so what happens is that in those residential areas, you have increasingly private food shops being opened. And the city, which is supposed to be regulating these private food shops, especially the butcher shops, just kind of turns a blind eye. So you have all these illegal meat shops that are opening up in the city, and also grocers that are selling things that they really shouldn't be selling. But the butchers especially, the licensed butchers really complained about the unlicensed butcher shops because the butchers had to pay fees they had to be licensed, they had to pay licensing fees, and they had to pay fees to sell in the markets. And the unlicensed butchers, who were basically operating illegally, didn't. And so there was a lot of resentment and argument and lots of petitions filed on the part of the licensed butchers to the city. But the city didn't really do too much to accommodate the butchers, and in fact, in 1843, the city basically deregulates the markets. And they take a much more laissez-faire attitude, which they have been doing for a while. They open up the city to allow private meat shops, private grocers, and so you have a very significant expansion after the 1840s of private retail food shops in the residential areas, the newer residential areas of the city. So these maps are actually from the book, and these maps show a little bit of that shift. So the public market system between 1786 and 1830 is on the left, and the public market system in 1865 plus selected food shops. So this, as I said, is from the book, and actually in the book I talk a lot about the marketing practices of one particular diarist, Carolyn Dustin. So this shows where Carolyn Dustin buys her food, and those are the selected private food shops that you see on that map. So she lived in the village. She did sometimes go to Jefferson Market, or more likely she sent her servants to Jefferson Market to do big marketing trips, but her marketing was all in private food shops located near her home. And these little dots all around here, and she had a lot of them. She had several confectioners, she had several greengrocers, she had several butchers, and she would, patronize all of them and get her foodstuffs from those various vendors. And also a little bit of kind of supplementing from the market. So it's essentially a flip. Right? In the early 19th century, in the colonial period, people got almost all of their food from the public markets and supplemented in the groceries. By the mid-19th century, most New Yorkers are getting all of their food from private food shops and supplementing with the markets. Now, the markets don't go away, of course, right? That very crowded scene that we see at Washington Market suggests that there is activity there. But the markets increasingly take on a wholesale function. So they are selling the food that is being sold in the greengrocers and in the butcher shops around the city. And the people who are likeliest to go to the public markets by the middle of the 19th century are people who are buying wholesale. So again, shopkeepers, also hoteliers, restaurant chefs, they're the ones who go to the public markets. Much like today, because Union Square Market is not a public market, right? But if you think about like Hunts Point, right, or the big terminal markets, those tend not to draw retail customers as much as they do wholesale. So what this means then, and actually before I say that, I want to say that there's also a flip in that the commentators on the New York food scene, I mean, if that's kind of modern, but you'll give it to me for now. The press, the diarists, reformers, they would talk about the markets as if they really wanted to reform the markets. They complained about the corruption. They complained about the state of the markets. And increasingly, they would talk about, or they would encourage people to go to the private food shops. And the New York Times is really kind of leading the charge here. The New York Times starts to say that nobody in their right mind would ever go to the public markets when they could go to these nice, clean, convenient private groceries near their homes. One New York Times reporter in 1860 says he was forced, quote, by business to resort diurnally to the public markets, which he described as these depots of fish, flesh, and fowl at the risk of his limbs, loss of his temper, and the damage of his clothes. He called the markets inconvenient, badly managed, illy constructed, and too much divided for all necessary purposes. He said the markets were so disorganized, quote, that none but the most expert ever succeeded to reaching the same point twice without the aid of a guide. Another commentator, Junius Henry Brown, who actually gave me the title of this book, he said of the markets, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect of, the market houses are like the finest foods being served on soiled tablecloths and chipped dishes, right? That the stuff that is in the markets is just amazing, but the setting of the market houses was horrific. And so there were demands to reform the markets, but those demands were not met. There was very little done in that direction, certainly in the 19th century. So what happens instead is that New Yorkers essentially vote with their feet, right, and with their pocketbooks, and they do frequent the private food shops much more so than the public markets. So that's great, right? Everything is great. There's all this food coming into the city. There's an abundance of it. It is cheaper in many cases than it was before because of these technological changes. People live in nice areas where there are all these nice food shops. But of course, we know that that is not the case, because what happens is, as the city becomes spatially stratified, that happens not only by function, but also by social class. And so where you live very significantly determines the quality of the food supply that you are able to have. Right, these nice residential middle class and elite districts have very fine food shops with very high quality food and nice and convenient services. But tenement districts, working class neighborhoods, sometimes those are the same thing. The food shops in those neighborhoods are not equivalent to the food shops in the wealthier wards. And in fact, a lot of those corner groceries in the tenement districts are really glorified liquor stores, or glorified bars, actually. They're essentially illegal saloons, because you couldn't actually sell, you could sell liquor by the glass. Without a license. And so what they were doing was that they were basically, turning these groceries into a bar, but if you were selling food, then you could call it a grocery and you could get away with this without this licensing issue. And so they would, have some food, but it was not very high quality. Reformers were very, very concerned about the poor quality of the food supply in those areas. And so again, what we consider this kind of modern development, this very close connection between social class, geography, and the quality of food supply, right? We hear a lot about food deserts. Michelle Obama talks about that a lot, and contemporary food reformers talk a lot about that. It's easy to think that that's a very contemporary concern, but actually the roots of that go back. I mean, they go back to the beginnings of this process of industrialization and this metropolitanization of the food supply. That is, again, a very historical development. So I just want to segue for a few minutes into another big change that occurs in the 19th century along these lines. Not only do we change how people are getting their food, where they're getting their food, but we also have a significant change in terms of the settings in which people are eating that food. And some of that has to do with the private dining room, but I'm not going to talk too much about that today. But what I am going to talk about is the public dining room, or the emergence of the restaurant in New York City. And I always say this, so forgive me if you've heard this before from me, or paraphrase from me, but people sort of think that New York was like born with a Sagat guide, right? That the Dutch arrived and they opened a restaurant, because New York is such a restaurant city. But that, of course, is not true. As I mentioned before, there are no restaurants in 18th century New York. There are very few freestanding restaurants in early 19th century New York, because there's simply not a need for the restaurant when the city is this walking city. People ate at home, and the idea of dining out as a social event, I mean, that did exist. People, there were dining clubs and there were taverns, but you did not have freestanding restaurants. And so that is an early 19th century development. So here we can see another set of maps showing us, on the left, New York City's restaurant scene in 1835, and on the right, New York City's restaurant scene in 1865. What we really should have is another map showing New York City's restaurant scene in 1800, which would be blank, right? Because as I said, there really aren't many restaurants, or any restaurants really, to speak of. So what happens, restaurants essentially go along two tracks. The first track, and they arise to meet a need, right? The first track is to cater to those commuters, this new person, right? This new figure in New York, who now lives up in those residential districts and commutes downtown to go to work. So the early New York City restaurants were so associated with commuters that when, say, the New York Times talked about restaurants, they would talk about them as a commuter institution, right? There's an article in the Times that I reference in the book that was titled New York's Restaurants, subtitle, how New Yorkers sleep uptown and eat downtown, right? So those early restaurants, the first restaurants that start to come up in the 1820s, 1830s, many of the ones on this map on the left, those restaurants are, by and large, serving a businessman's lunch, and they are short order houses. In other words, they were not places where you went and had a fine dining experience or relished really anything. They were fast and chaotic and loud, and they were known for serving food that was like barely digestible. And they also were known for serving people who barely swallowed their food, right? Because this was a commuter function or a businessman's lunch. These men would come in, they would eat their meals in 20 minutes from, sitting down, ordering, and pay their check and leave. And again, there was lots and lots of commentary about that kind of activity. Here's one from George Foster, who was a prolific journalist who wrote about the New York scene in the 1840s. A New York eating house at high tide is a scene which would well repay the labors of an antiquarian or a panoramist. A thoroughbred diner downtown will look at a bill of fare, order his dinner, and both it and himself, and be engaged in putting off a lot of goods upon a greenhorn while you are getting your napkin fixed over your nankeens and deciding whether you will take oxtail or mock turtle. A regular downtowner surveys the kitchen with his nose as he comes upstairs, selects his dish by intuition, and swallows it by steam and the electrogalvanic battery. As to digesting it, that is none of his business. He has paid all liabilities to his stomach, and that is all he knows or cares about the matter. The stomach must manage its own affairs. He is not in that line. So this gives us a sense, right, of these connections between business, New York's business culture, New York as a financial center and commercial center, and the rise of these restaurants. Elsewhere, Foster actually says that New York's business culture basically wouldn't have existed without the restaurants, right? That these eating houses really allow for the smooth carriage of business in the downtown areas of the city. So these restaurants definitely served a need, but they were not for everybody, right? One group that they definitely were not for was respectable women, for example, or any women for that matter. They really had a policy. The women were not really accepted into these restaurants. They were not, like I mentioned, for like a leisurely meal. Families did not go to these restaurants. But relatively quickly, you have the development of a real restaurant scene in New York that goes beyond these short order houses. So by the 1850s, restaurants start to come up on the scene in the 1830s. By the 1850s, you have a tremendous range of restaurants. You have thousands of them, from a handful in 1830 to thousands in 1850, and they cover a very significant range. So these are pictures of some of them. On the top left is a cake and coffee shop. This was by the docks. This would have been open all night. So the city that never sleeps has arrived. And some of those restaurants were known as cheap and nasty, which needs no explanation. Below that is, actually, let's not do it that way. Let's do it clockwise. To the right of that is Delmonico's. Delmonico's follows the other track, right? I mentioned there are two tracks. One is the commuter restaurants. I didn't forget. One is the commuter restaurant, and the second is the hotel restaurant. So at the same time that you have these commuter restaurants coming up, the short order houses, you have the development of hotel restaurants, these luxury hotels, like the Astor House Hotel. In the 1850s, there's a big spate of luxury hotel building in New York. The St. Nicholas, the Fifth Avenue Hotel, they are very expensive, they are very fancy, and they have very fancy dining rooms. But most of those hotels were on the American plan, which meant that you paid for your room and your meals were included with it. And the meals were served at a set time, family style. And so actually over time, the freestanding restaurants emerged, and it's the flip. Over time, some of the restaurants the hotels turned to the European plan, where you could just pay for your room and eat your meals out. And then you start to have more and more freestanding restaurants that are catering not just to commuters, but also to tourists and to wealthier people who want a more refined meal out. Delmonico's really pioneers fine dining in New York. They opened in the 1830s. They are a far cry from the short order house. They are really known for the sumptuousness of the environment that you're eating in, for the French chefs and the very fine cuisine that they serve. And over the course of the 19th century, Delmonico's, I mean, really for a very long time, through the 1890s, Delmonico's is really the center of New York's elite social culture. You know, it was a sign that you really made it if you could dine at Delmonico's on a regular basis. On the right, top right, is a ladies' restaurant. So by the 1830s, some savvy entrepreneurs are developing ladies' restaurants to cater to those respectable women, or women who are concerned about their reputations, middle class, and well, especially middle class women, elite women as well, who are shopping downtown and aren't going to eat lunch in those short order houses. And so you have these restaurants like Taylor's, ladies' restaurants like Taylor's Epicurean Palace or Thompson's Ladies' Restaurant that really distinguish themselves by their appointments. They're really trying to replicate the parlor of the private home. So they create what historian Mary Ryan would call like a semi-public space for women, that it allows women who are concerned about their reputations to be out and about in public commercial establishments, but it has a kind of semi-private aspect to it so that it allows them to, you know, maintain their reputation or not sully their reputation. And that was important because as the restaurants develop, they do have a kind of, even the fancy restaurants have a little bit of a salacious reputation. Even Delmonico's, this will give you a sense why. Even Delmonico's, you could rent a private box to have your meals. And there was, you know, lots of prostitutes kind of prowling these places like the theaters of New York in the 19th century as well. And so it was very important to women who had reputations that they be in like a clean space, figuratively. Underneath that is a not so clean space. That's a oyster cellar, as represented in George Foster's New York in Slices. Oyster cellars were like the pizza parlors of the 19th century in New York. They were just so ubiquitous. They were very much part of New York City's culture. And they also kind of represented a range from very kind of down and dirty basement, all you can eat, to very fine establishments. And Suzanne mentioned that I'm working on this, or just starting to work on this biography of Thomas Downing, who was an African-American oysterman who ran a very respectable oyster house in 19th century New York that was frequented by the political and economic elite of the city, and also their families. And then on the bottom left is we're moving into the second half of the 19th century and, you know, the real articulation of New York City's restaurant culture. By this point, there are multiple thousands of restaurants. As New York, in the second half of the 19th century, expands into a real immigrant city, 80% of the population of New York by the end of the 19th century is foreign-born or the children of foreign-born. You have a very significant immigrant dining scene, an ethnic, we would today call ethnic dining scene, emerging in New York. So the bottom left is a Chinese restaurant, kind of outing to a Chinese restaurant. So I'm not going to talk too much about the ethnic restaurants or about the cosmopolitanization of New York City's dining cuisine, because again, it's in the book. But I do want to say this, that, you know, by the 1870s, commentators are talking about New York's dining scene like they do today, you know, saying that you could have breakfast in Germany and lunch in Italy and dinner in China, and that you could basically go around the world in New York without ever leaving the city because there was such a tremendous diversity of dining options in such a cosmopolitan dining scene. But it's really not until the 20th century that, and well into the 20th century, that that cosmopolitan dining scene is considered from the perspective of the of the cuisine. In other words, it was the diner, the white diner, the Euro diner, who would go into these restaurants, who was considered to be cosmopolitan. And the restaurants kind of created a hybrid cuisine if they wanted to attract a non-immigrant clientele. So if they wanted to attract a clientele that was native New Yorkers, the Italian restaurants, for example, would really hybridize their cuisine and make it much more palatable to the native-born palate. So, you know, New Yorkers, that sort of cosmopolitan is a little bit of arm's length in terms of the dining culture in the 19th century. So, so at the same time, you have this sort of, you not only have a cosmopolitan dining scene, you also just have, by the end of the 19th century, a cosmopolitan food scene in New York, right? As a result of all these changes, the transportation changes, the spread of the city, the growth of the city, the rise of the restaurants, the changes in terms of the retail food shops, many of which actually are stocking food that comes from around the world. New York itself is becoming a major, or has become a major exporter of foods around the world, and so there is this real capital of the United States, and that process is really solidified by the end of the 19th century, and it's very much rooted in, or I should say, the culmination of the developments that I've been talking about up to this point. So again, now you know, when people talk about some of these developments as new, we know that they actually have a long history, and so if we want to undo some of them, we have to be aware of how far that history goes back. And I will end there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Thank you. Yeah, come sit down and we'll do a Q&A. I wanted to start with a question of mine, because I'm the world's authority on the Essex Street Market. So I wanted to ask you about marketplaces and why you ended at the end of the 19th century. I'm curious because there were so many changes in the beginning of the 20th century, including the closing of many markets.
That's why I ended at the end of the 19th century. So yeah, and you know, it's true. I mean, when people call me to ask me about 20th century food, I send them to Suzanne. Because my work really is very much grounded in the 19th century. And there's I mean, 1890 is a good endpoint because there's really a lot of there are many changes in the 20th century and as significant as the changes we see in the 19th century, but it's kind of like a second generation. There's some fundamentally different developments that are happening in that period of time in terms of the industrialization of the food supply and also in terms of the actual supply, like you're talking about, where the food is being sold, how it's getting to the consumer. So it feels like the sequel, right? It's the sequel to what I talk about in this book.
Can you talk a little bit about meat? That's the other thing that I'm an expert on is meat. Because you talked about how the shops became legal in 1846. What happens after that to meat?
So yeah, it's 1843 that the meat shops, or that the markets are deregulated. I mean, meat is a big topic, and a lot of people are studying actually that topic. Are really focusing on the meat supply. So for one thing, the slaughterhouse system changes, the way that the meat is coming in. Once you have the refrigerated rail car, that changes the distribution of meat. So that's when you start to have the decline of the meatpacking district in New York. I mean, Chicago really overtakes New York City by the end of the 19th century in terms of being the major supplier of meat, although New York, as you know, is still very important in the kosher meat slaughtering and butchering. So New York kind of holds on to that, well into the 20th century.
Thank you. Okay, questions and answers from the audience? Questions? Why don't you just stand up and ask your question, and then I'll repeat it.
Sure. I don't think of flies that feed you advertising. Why did they call it fly market?
Oh, why was it called Fly Market?
Was that the first picture of the market down where the South Street Seaport is now?
Yes, so it's near there. It's actually a little bit north of that. Fly Market was the major market of the East Side in the 18th century and the very early 19th century, and then it actually closes and is replaced by Fulton Market. So I didn't mention Fulton Market in the talk, but Fulton Market then becomes like the East Side corollary to Washington Market in the mid-19th century, and Fulton Market has a particularly active fish market, and eventually it's the Fulton Fish Market, and the other part kind of goes away. So when you think of Fulton Fish Market, that's the successor essentially to Fly Market in that area. And the Fly, you're right. You would not, this is a sign that their marketing ideas are different from ours, right? I mean, by marketing, I mean advertising. But that actually comes from the Dutch. It is VLY, the VLY market, and I can't remember. I have been asked this question before, but I can't remember, what it means.
It doesn't mean fly.
It doesn't mean fly, no.
Yeah.
It means the most delicious food can be found here, market. What's that?
I think it's the boat that took some flight.
The vote? Oh, the boat. Oh, the boat. Oh, yeah, that could be. You know, I like I said, I've been asked this question before, and I look it up, and then I forget. It flies out of my head.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, where do people who ran pushcarts get their food from? People on the Lower East Side.
Okay, the question is, where do people from the Lower East Side who ran pushcarts get their food from?
Yes. No, I know what you mean. It's just, that's also kind of a complex answer because there's a few things happening there. So there's street vendors who sell food out on the streets, and that goes back to the 17th century. And by the way, you know what else went back to the 17th century? People complaining about the street vendors on this, blocking the sidewalks. And then there are the pushcart vendors who are, come up more in the mid-19th century. They kind of replaced the hucksters a little bit, actually. And then there are the permanent pushcart markets, like what I think you're asking about, like Hester Street on the Lower East Side. Those eventually are taken indoors in the 1930s. And they're different generations, so that's why they would get their food at different times, but basically from the markets as well. The hucksters, were scavenging in some cases, or they were getting their foods from the markets, even when the markets were retail. But the pushcart vendors are going to the wholesale markets.
Yes.
Can you discuss a bit about the transitions of popular foods in the 19th century?
You're asking about popular foods during the 19th century?
What do you mean by popular foods?
Well, I know in the Dutch period, oysters were very common as a basic fare. As the oyster beds were used up, the population moved on to other popular foods.
So she's asking about oysters.
Right, so by popular, you mean like food trends or crazes, or you mean food for the people? Okay, yeah, so oysters are an interesting example, right? Because oysters, in the 17th century, oysters are really food for the poor. New York is a major, was a major, the oyster beds of New York were incredible in the colonial period. They just were, lining the beaches, and people would just go down and scoop them up. Some of those hucksters would go and get clams and oysters from the shore and then sell them on the street. They were very, very abundant, but by the early 19th century, they actually depleted the beds, and then you have these oyster entrepreneurs who search for a marketable, cultivated oyster, and they actually go to the Chesapeake for that, and they bring up Virginia oysters that can grow in a year, and they plant them in New York Harbor. And so when that starts to happen, then the oyster becomes more expensive because it's actually a cultivated, it's farmed, right? A cultivated product. But it's really not until the end of the 19th century when they pollute the waters of New York so much that the oysters become rare that it becomes more expensive. But through the 19th century is like kind of the heyday of the New York oyster. And everybody, I mean, I actually didn't mention this in the talk, I forgot, but there is a parallel between what I mentioned with the markets, the food supply being, geographically determined, and the restaurants. But at the same time, restaurants really are part of the public culture in 19th century New York in a way that the food stores are different. I mean, by the end of the 19th century, there is such a range of restaurants at so many different levels of the economic scale that pretty much anybody can have some sort of public dining option. And oyster cellars, also reflect that scale. I don't know about like food kind of, people often ask me about food crazes, and oysters are definitely one, but you don't see that many, you don't have a cronut, right, in the 19th century.
Yes.
Does the Civil War have any effect on your food?
No.
The Civil War.
He asked if the Civil War has any effect on New York food. Yes, there is some effect in foods that are coming up from the South, aren't making it into New York for a while. Some of that expansion of the hinterlands of New York goes down where you'll have fruits from the South coming in and expanding the seasons, and obviously there is a stop on that, but I think that the impact of the Civil War is more about the industrial technologies that emerge as a result of the war, canning, for example, right, and food preservation that then goes into civilian life during and after the war. And New York is a center of those kinds of processing, like Borden's Milk, right, is located in New York, and and Heinz, and a lot of the preservation and processing centers are located here, and that's definitely related to the war.
Yes.
Was there any colonial licenses that you gave in the 19th century?
What was the question? Are there any?
Colonial licenses for restaurants in the 19th century?
Oh, okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Are you asking, is there a licensing of restaurants or a health inspection? There is of the markets. As I mentioned, the markets are regulated and there is a system of market inspectors. And in fact, in the colonial period, market fees and the market inspectors, they were public officials, and market fees paid the mayor's salary. So yeah, there was an interest in getting those market fees. I mean, the mayor didn't work for money, right? I mean, the mayor of New York in that period was very much a patrician, serving out of a sense of noblesse oblige. Restaurants, no, that's a 20th century development. Really, I think after the 1920s, when you start to see those inspections, and of course the grading is, that's Bloomberg. Yeah.
Yes.
When did, was it at that time, or was it in the 20th century, that the restaurants started allowing women to work for them? For example, Keynes, I know, was in the 1940s or so, Keynes State.
The question is about when women were allowed into restaurants.
Without men, right? So the women alone in restaurants is 20th century, like turn of the 20th century, sort of. Everything has to be tempered. There were some restaurants in the second half of the 19th century. Actually, there were business women, right, who would. So some of those downtown restaurants, they get a little bit more refined by the second half of the 19th century. You do have the short order houses and the cheap and nasty restaurants in the later period, my later period, but you also have table d'hôte restaurants that were kind of a fixed price, and they were really working to cater more towards middle class people who would go in and who didn't want to eat in that kind of rushed environment, and they cater to women at lunch who are working. And you also have female clerks in the late 19th century working in the office buildings of Lower Manhattan and of Midtown Manhattan, and so there were restaurants that catered to them. But as a sort of social event, like, you know, the way that we think about that, that's really late 19th and early 20th century. I do want to say this, because it's pretty interesting. Those ladies' restaurants, like Taylor's and Thompson's, they were not female bastions entirely. Men could go into those restaurants, but they had to be escorted by a lady.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Yes.
When were the first restaurants in the world?
When were the first restaurants in the world?
When or where?
When and where?
Well, you know the answer to that is Paris. Paris really invents the restaurant. In fact, there is a very interesting book called The Invention of the Restaurant by Rebecca Span about Parisian restaurants. And she says, among other things, that restaurants in France, and that's in like the late 18th century, that restaurants in France actually, when they began, they were not a place, they were a thing. A restaurant was a restorative broth, and restaurants were guild-run in Paris, and they were a place actually to go when you were sick to get this restorative broth. And after the American Revolution, the guilds are broken down, and that association eventually falls out, and then the restaurant, as we understand it, starts to emerge.
That's interesting.
I'm glad I read that book.
Yes.
What was the typical menu of fine dining American restaurant?
The question is, what was a typical menu for a fine dining restaurant?
Yeah, so Delmonico's, right, is the sort of pinnacle of fine dining. And when Delmonico's starts out, I mean, even in the Delmonico's actually, when it first starts out, is a relatively modest affair. But pretty quickly they turn it into a less modest. And they had an 11-page menu. And French, very French. And that continues over the 19th century. And so it actually can get a little bit silly, because you'll have things on the menu in French, like, I know I'm going to speak in French, which is a little bit embarrassing in front of such a big audience, but they would have like truite de Long Island, which was trout from Long Island, but they would be written in French on the menu. So the menus would be in courses, and they would have kind of very prepared dishes, not the kind of simplicity, right, that we like in our menus today. So you would have all kinds of oysters, and prepared in various different ways, and then you had sometimes canapes, and then you would have sometimes salads and soups, right? It's French, and then various different prepared dishes. So but Delmonico's pioneered some dishes that are still in our lexicon today, like lobster Newburgh and baked Alaska, right? So you would have a whole range of desserts. And they had the same thing. They had pastry chefs, and they had grill cooks and fry cooks, and they had dozens of people working in these restaurants as well.
Yes.
Well, the book is only about Manhattan, because the book ends in 1890, and New York City is not the 5 boroughs until 1898. So yes, the book is 19th century New York, which at that point means New York City. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is the ways in which New York's metropolitanization is involved in this process. So what was then its suburbs in what's now the boroughs, gets addressed as well.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for taking us to
And I ask him, he's sitting right next to you.
Any other questions or comments? I want to tell everyone that Cindy's book is for sale out front, and she's going to be happy to sign it. So please, please go and buy a book and have her sign it. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, and thank you, Suzanne.